Your panels are gonna look about like this. You want to press them. It's better, it's easier to do your truing. I've got one actually, thank you though. So the back is pretty straightforward. You're going to connect all your lines, and this is the first step of sort of straightening your lines, connecting all your markings. It's not in paper yet, where you can do the definitive, the finite truing steps, where you fold the paper, your dart legs aren't gonna wiggle around on you. We've already dropped the neckline, so you don't have to do any of that type of stuff for the front or back. Darts are all gonna be straight. You don't need curved darts, so if you marked your darts all along the dart legs, you wanna even those out. Don't trust that curve. We're just doing straight darts all around. Next thing is, so connecting all the lines. I already dropped my armholes on the drape. So this would be higher up here if I marked it like we do our perfectly fit armholes. We mark it right under the arm plate, metal arm plate, and then drop it 3/4. For things with no sleeves, for garments with no sleeves, you don't need to extend it. We like a close fitting armhole and side seam for sleeveless garments. That's not to say every single sleeveless garment doesn't have at least a little bit or some sort of extension here. It all depends on the design and the look that you want. So the back is a regular fisheye. That's straight as well. Just connect your cross marks at the widest part to your vanishing points. You're still going to curve the widest areas. That angular shape, you want to just mitigate that a little bit by softening it up with your French curve. It's not a whole huge chunk. It can just be like that. It's just very minor, subtle, just so you don't have those two sharp points trying to sew together. I have a notch at my side seam. That would be smart to have. If you didn't do some of these notches, you can get away with doing it in paper, or just repin your bodice. It has nothing to do with the collar. So if you're missing marks on your bodice, just repin that really quickly and you can get those marks. When I'm transferring this onto paper, I have my waist and my hip HBLs, my horizontal balance lines, that are going to talk to each other. So once I've trued everything on my drape, on the muslin panels, meaning I've connected all of my lines, got my shoulders, got my lines filled in for this. I don't even need to really pencil that in. It's solid enough to just take my tracing wheel to it. What's going to be a little weird and new to you guys is this French dart and this fisheye that's going into a seam right here. So I have my, I missed a mark. I don't have my cross marks on either side of this, but it's okay. I can see my fold lines. It's about right here. So I'm going to give myself a generous pencil line where I can see it folded together. And when I make this come together with the excess of my dart going toward the center or toward the center waist or center front, all of it's going that way, that's going to tell me what this side seam is doing. Only when that's closed can I see what needs to happen with truing that side seam. I'll put my straight ruler right over it to connect all of this upper area. And I'll do this in paper as well, to take my tracing wheel and find out the exact shape that I need out of that. This has a little bit of shape here into a slight curvature for my upper hip, my high hip. You can use your hip curve for that to make it really nice and smooth. So, and these are straight too. We haven't really done curved darts, which is a bit of a different construction process, and they're harder for sure.
Is this supposed to like end at the bust line though?
Nope, that bust line is where your apex is. So you never want a dart to come all the way to that. It means that it's too close. Was your dart coming all the way to the bust line?
Yeah, I thought we were supposed to do it to the bust line.
Were you forcing it to do that? Or were you just taking out what material you had?
I don't remember.
Okay. A good way to check your work is to re-pin this when you have it all filled out. So the other thing is this fisheye dart that starts with the top area of the fisheye that goes to a point like normal, or vanishing point, backed off from the apex right here. It's going to go into a full seam. This could also be a release tuck, just for later on when you're thinking about design elements that you can use in your original designs for whatever senior collection classes you're doing later. This is something you can just put seam allowance in when you're patterning it, and then you just stitch it together. It just becomes a seam. Or you stitch this like a normal dart, right? Bring these two edges together, stitch it all the way from this point at the top. So it looks like a normal dart at the top, and you keep all of that fabric below, and it becomes a little release tuck. So you would stitch it and then back tack really good when you want it to stop. Maybe it's below the waist, and then it's almost like a box pleat, inverted box pleat. That would be like a release tuck. So it's a nice detail to do with this. For the bottom area of this, so if this is my waist right here, I'm going to continue this line like this, because this is the bottom part of our dart. These dart legs should be straight too. Notice that it's at a little bit of an angle. That's okay. If that's what your drape wanted and it looked good and smooth, happy together on the form, then it will be good and smooth pinning or sewing it together. From this end point, about 5 inches below, I have 4.75 inches. Around that, 4.5 or 4 3/4 or 5 inches below your waist, you can start dropping this down parallel to one another. If you are truing this and it is not already parallel with your straight grain, then you might want to check it. Repin this front and see if it's dragging in a weird spot. But typically, if you have your lines, your dart legs going out wider at the bottom, it's going to be more fitted when you get down to the hip. And we don't really need that. We need some room for the legs to walk around and stuff. Let's see, what else?
The waistline, does it go straight? Because it looks a little curved.
Yeah, so you can, you establish this. Our marks on here will tell you where to put your HBLs, but you want to equalize this, level it out. So I know this is where they talk to each other at the side seam. That's where I'm going to draw my long HBL across my paper to then line these two up on. If these aren't lining up with it, I might change this a little bit or meet halfway take an eighth off here, take an eighth off here. And then that way I've just corrected my HBL. The other thing
So they have
is,
to be straight, right? They're not perfect.
if you're going to use HBLs to create your patterns, it's just a way to check patterns against each other. So it's a good thing, piece of information to have. Do the normal establishing the grain lines. Long straight grains with your side seams together. Don't do center front to center back. Side seams together, find your waist HBL. You put your shoulder blade line and your bust line. Those are two different things, but this waistline and hip line should be shared. These two will be off from one another. I'm talking about lines on your paper, drawing those in before you fully trace this off.
What notches do we have to have that correspond with the shawl collar for the front?
Right.
Is there any that we have to make sure we have?
So this one, and I can tell this is my corrected one. This one back here because I put a little red extra. I saw this initial one wasn't right, so I put one further back. That HPS is going to stitch to your HPS in the back panel, right? That's going to be our shoulder seam, which tells us where our collar lines up to. So this one was my HPS for the collar seam. Now, this is what I was talking about with the collar piece. You're gonna have your seam line on one side, and you're gonna have your style line on the other side. This is to be expected, this little whoop-de-loop right here. It's gonna start out at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular with your center back line, and it's totally expected to have a small curve. The multiple lines that you see here are just me sketching in a line. I know that my more solid line is the one I wanted to follow, so don't look at that as meaning anything other than me just trying out different shapes. I want to keep my grain that I have on here, so I transfer that grain before I do this, transfer it to pattern paper. But when I'm trying to get both sides of this now, if you didn't use a marker like this, it's gonna be hard to see. So you might want to, after you take it off, if it's just in pencil, try to go around it again with some marker so you can see through it. And you're just gonna trace off this outer line like this, after you have your straight grain line established. And then I can see my red line right here. It's probably hard to see, but I can see through it. I even put a notch right here that's gonna match where this should stitch to on my bodice neckline. I can see where my HPS should stitch to. And I even put a notch, this is extra, but you should get into the mindset of thinking like this. I even put a notch a little bit away from it that lines up with our neckline dart. So that little dart will line up with this notch. And I'll continue to my center back. Right? That's not hard. Test it out. After you do this, quickly pin it back together and see what your work looks like. You can trim this out fully, leaving like a little quarter. This is why we did these 3 rows of stitching, so we have some area that is stitched together and will hold whatever shape we have.
Are we supposed to draw where it folds to?
No, you don't need a roll line in there. We're gonna do some applications to the roll line in your jacket in the tailoring class, but for this, it's just going to happen where it happens, you know. But that is a good point. Sometimes patterns do have the roll line dashed in there. Yeah, Ben?
So this would be more like, if we were actually making the collar, it would be more of a worksheet, and we would do like an underlayer and a top layer, right?
It would both be the same pattern, because if we were gonna back this collar, that inside layer that would be the backing, even if it was using the self fabric like this, just 2 layers of muslin, it's going to be completely hidden in there.
Okay.
We have a good side that would come back and roll around. This would be the good side of our fabric. But then we would have to pattern an entire facing that took up space on the bodice side, and also enough space to, and the right shape to come around and cover up the backed interior layer.
Okay.
And that's how it would finish off on the edge. You guys are gonna see how to pattern that facing in tailoring when we do the jacket. It's pretty cool. It really finishes it off nicely. Any other questions? Okay. All right.